Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Live with Mel. This episode is brought to you by Yellow Cab Company of DC. If you're looking to avoid rideshare prices, then check out the Yellow Cab Company of DC when you are in the nation's capital. Tension is still growing on the border in Russia between the Ukraine and Russia. Western allies are starting to put forces together in order to deal with the imminent threats. Now, again, many people believe that Russia is poised to invade the Ukraine at any time. And Western allies are working together in order to ensure that Ukraine will be protected if it does happen. Now, while this is happening, Russia has continued to say that it has no plans to invade Ukraine. And while it's saying it has no plans, many of the intelligence information that the Western nations are getting shows that that is not the case. And the other fact is that Russia has deployed over 100,000 soldiers to the border, and they are conducting military exercises, including live firing, live ammunition, and other military trainings. Now, at this point, Ukraine is trying to calm its citizens and saying that the threat is not imminent, that it's still a possibility, but the threat is not imminent. However, even with this all going on, Russia is now making threats itself. Now, Russia has made several threats against the West and has essentially said that if the Western nations do not listen to their demands, that there will be retaliation. Now, Russia does have a few demands of the Western nations, which again, it seems the Western nations are not going to fold to these demands because of what they are. A lot of the demands include Ukraine and other Eastern European nations and their admittance to NATO. Now, what are these demands? One of the demands that Putin has made is that they want NATO to commit to never allowing Ukraine or other Eastern European nations that were once part of the USSR to ever join NATO. They want to have the commitment from NATO that they will never admit these nations into NATO. Now, the reason being, and then this is speculation, is because President Putin wants to make Russia the USSR again. It wants Russia to return to its glory days. And that includes taking over, invading, conquering the nations that separated from Russia. And if they do join NATO, that would be much harder. Because again, if you are a member of NATO and someone invades or attacks you, the other countries that are a part of NATO will come to your defense. So again, Putin is very adamant about Ukraine and other nations that used to be part of the USSR not joining NATO. So in the future, they can again join and be part of Russia. Now, that is not the only demand that Putin is making. The other demand is that he wants the Western allies to curb their preparation for an invasion of Ukraine. Again, Putin has said time and time again that he's not planning on invading Ukraine. But with everything that's going on at the border, most people believe that to be false, especially because there's over 100,000 soldiers at the border. But Russia wants the allies to start pulling back. They want the allies to not send troops, not send financial aid, not send weapons, which the allies have already done. This is something that could stop Putin from accomplishing his goals. It could stop Putin from going into Ukraine. and he is now making his demands. Now, earlier this week, I did make the comment that Russia will be looking to try and frame it as though the West started any type of conflict if conflict does occur. With Putin saying these demands, it looks as though that is what he's trying to do. So when he does eventually invade Ukraine, he can say it was because of the tension that the West caused. It was because the West would not agree to not allowing these countries to join NATO, and the West would not agree from pulling troops back from around the border, and they continue to send aid. This is all part of his game. This is all something that he is trying to do, again, to put the blame on the West. Now, the West has not at this time responded, but it doesn't look as though they're going to meet Russia's demand. Because number one, they cannot allow another country, such as Russia, to determine who is allowed to join NATO and who is not allowed to join NATO. The only people who should be allowed to do that are the members of NATO, the countries that are part of NATO, and they have to agree. By folding to Russia's demand, the West will essentially put Russia in a position of extreme power. It will essentially make Russia the say all be all of who can join the alliance, who can join NATO. And they cannot put that power in the hands of Putin. But again, we do have to wait to see what the Western allies and what NATO responds. Now, pulling back troops could be a possibility. However, if troops start pulling back from Ukraine, if they stop sending aid, if they stop sending lethal aid, and again, that's the term they use for sending weapons, guns, rockets, explosives, etc. to Ukraine, it could leave Ukraine in a very vulnerable position. Russia is a huge country with a capable military. They could easily come in and crush Ukraine. And their main line of defense is their own soldiers and their own military, but also the allies that they have formed in the West. Now, while Russia is making these demands, hopefully the West does not fold. Again, Western nations do want to handle this diplomatically. They want to handle this without actually having conflict. But with what Putin is doing, what Putin has done in the past, it seems as though we are heading towards conflict, and conflict is inevitable. But again, they still want to do this diplomatically before any type of war, before any type of conflict arises. But with the demands that Putin is making, with the demands that he is putting towards the West, it seems as though it could be an impossible task. And I think the biggest demand that he is asking for is for NATO to agree to his terms, for him to try and control who NATO allows in and who they don't allow in. Again, Putin is looking to NATO to make the promise that they will not allow Ukraine to join NATO and any other Eastern European country that was once a part of the USSR. That is an absolutely ridiculous demand, and that power cannot be put in the hands of Russia or Putin. Now, why? Why does Putin want that demand? And again, like I stated before, the biggest reason is if you are a member of NATO, allies will come to your defense if you are invaded. I believe Putin has big plans, which involves war, which involves invading countries that were once part of Russia. Putin wants Russia to return to its previous glory. Putin wants to put the country in a position it was. And to do that, they will have to invade Eastern European countries. And if these countries are a member of NATO, it wouldn't be Russia versus the small Eastern European country. It would be Russia versus all the members of NATO's, all the Western allies. And Putin is trying to stop this. However, the West cannot fold to his demands. The West cannot allow Putin to have control over this. And then let's go to the comments. Joanna says, well, Pentagon announced up to 8,500 U.S. troops are now on high alert for possible deployment. It seems that Putin has control of the game. Ridiculous. I don't think that Putin has control of the games. Putin does not want to go to war with the West, but Putin does want to conquer the Eastern European countries. He believes that Ukraine belongs to Russia, and nothing you do will change that his view with that. Now, Russia came out with several statements. Lavrov said, if the West continues its aggressive course, Moscow will take the necessary retaliatory measures. We won't allow our proposal to be drowned in endless discussion. Our Western colleagues have driven themselves up into a military frenzy. The Ukraine elite itself has grown a bit scared by the Western scare. So with the rhetoric that is coming out of Russia, we do see that Russia's plan to blame it on the West is continuing to grow. The propaganda that they're spreading is that essentially the West is causing the scare, the West is causing the tension, the West is causing this. And now again, I'm going to read that last sentence from Lavrov. The Ukraine elite itself has grown a bit scared by the Western scare. Essentially what Russia is saying is that Ukraine wasn't scared before, but because the West is scared, it's now causing the Ukraine elite, Ukraine politicians, the Ukrainian people to be scared. They are placing the blame on the West, even though Russia has been the aggressor time and time again. But in order for them to accomplish their goals, they have to spin it and put propaganda on it. Now on Tuesday, Ukrainian leaders tried to calm the population. During a press conference, they said that they are, excuse me, guys, they're reassuring the Ukrainian people that the threat of Russian invasion is real, but it's not imminent. Now, again, Ukrainians must be living in fear at the moment, especially if you live near the border. Many people feel as though it is imminent. However, the Ukrainian government is trying to calm the people. They're saying that the threat is real, but it's not imminent. But the way that military pressure is building up across the border, I could understand why the Ukrainian people think that it is imminent. So what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts about Russia making these demands of the West? Do you think the West will fold to Putin's demands, or do you think it's just going to cause more and more tension? The tension is building every single day. Many people think that war is imminent, even though the Western world still would prefer to deal with the situation diplomatically. Last week, even President Biden tried to put forth the idea that they would hold a summit virtually to try and calm the situation down. But again, it doesn't seem as though Russia wants to take that route. Even though they want to put the blame on the West, they do not want to take this route. And I'm going to read part of what Russia came out with, again, a small part. They said, We won't allow our proposal to be drowned in endless discussion. It looks as though they're not looking for the diplomatic approach. With Russia saying they won't allow it to be drowned in endless discussion means they don't want to go back and forth. Now, the only thing that Russia is looking for is for the West to meet their demands. And if the West doesn't meet their demands, then they're going to retaliate. Now, something else, another demand that Russia did make is they warned against any personal sanctions on Vladimir Putin. If the West puts any type of sanction on Putin, they're going to retaliate. Now, this was said because Biden on Tuesday did make the comment that that could be a possibility. Again, the West is still looking to deal with this diplomatically and not go into any type of armed conflict. And they were floating around different ideas of how they could do this diplomatically. They were floating around ideas how they could do this without going to war. And one of the ideas that came up was to personally sanction Putin. So not necessarily the country, not Russia, but Putin himself. And Russia came back and said, as part of their demands, that if any personal sanctions are put on Putin, that they will retaliate. They're not looking to do this diplomatically. They're not looking to deal with this in a way where countries can come together and compromise. They're saying these are our demands. This is what we want. And if our demands are not met, then we will retaliate. And I think this is all part of their plan to blame any type of conflict on the West. They want to spread the propaganda that the West is a reason for this tension, that the West is a reason for the conflict. And again, this is something that Putin does. Putin and Russia are masterminds of spinning propaganda within Russia. And that is what they're looking to do. Now, again, they're making demands, and they're making demands that the West probably will not agree to. And because of this, I think war will be imminent. I think because of this, it will lead to armed conflict around the border between Russia and Ukraine. It's something that if we look like we're going in that direction. The U.S. is sending troops, or preparing to send troops. The U.S. has already sent lethal aid, so guns, ammunition, rockets, etc. Other countries across the Western world have sent troops, have sent money, have sent financial aid, and it looks as though we are preparing for war as a globe. And this is something that's going to involve the entire Western world against Russia. And if the entire Western world is going against Russia, Russia may have some allies that come out to help as well. No one wants to go to war besides Putin. But it looks as though Putin is pushing the buttons. Hopefully, this could be handled with diplomacy. And conflict is something that we do avoid. The world economy right now is fragile. We're still dealing with a global pandemic. The supply chain is breaking down, and this is time for war. It's never a good time for war. But at the moment, with so much going wrong across the globe, war is the last thing that people need. War is something that we should be, we should be trying to avoid. But again, this is something that Putin has had his eyes on. He invaded Ukraine before, and we dealt with it, and we tried to handle it diplomatically. Putin is going to continue to try to go after Ukraine and other Eastern European nations because he believes that they still belong to Russia. The West has a lot of decisions to make, and they have to come to terms with how they're going to deal with these demands. But we do see, it looks as though the West is preparing for war. Because not only are we sending aid, we're sending soldiers, we're sending money, but many Western European nations and the United States and Canada have started pulling diplomats. So right now, all diplomats and their families are being told to leave the capital of the Ukraine. And that usually happens when some type of conflict is about to happen. So again, war could be inevitable. Hopefully we're able to deal with this diplomatically, but with the demands that Russia are making, it doesn't seem as though it's something that the West could agree to. So much for tuning in. My name is Mel. I come live every single Monday through Wednesday to bring you guys current events that are happening across the globe and right here in this great nation as well. I will keep you updated about everything that's happening with the tension between Russia, the Ukraine, and the West. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and I will see everyone bright and early next week. Have a great weekend, everyone. Bye.